I mean, there's something very funny about someone whose very brand is gold-plated, ostentatious displays of wealth to become the poster boy for American Christianity.
Hi, this is Frank Schaeffer, and you are watching In Conversation with Frank Schaeffer, and or listening on podcast or watching on YouTube or Facebook Live, whatever. Right now we're live. And today I'm talking to Jerome Copulsky, who teaches and studies, and who I first met because he was researching for a book related to the impact of my father on American history and the Reconstructionists and evangelicals and the slide to the right wing and so forth. And when I was done that conversation with Jerome, I kind of joked with him that he knows more about my family's impact on American history than I do, because he's been studying all this stuff and I've been trying to forget about it for the last 40 years, although intermittently writing about it, as in my new book that's coming out November 2nd, where the whole forward kind of reviews some of this: fall in love, have children, stay put, save the planet, be happy. And in my memoir before that, Crazy for God, and other books. But Jerome, I want to talk to you today first about why you got in touch with me. What have you been researching? And then let's just take it from there. But before I do that, could you please do all the fancy stuff and talk about being a research fellow at the Berkley Center for Religion, whatever that is, Peace and World Affairs at Georgetown University, on and on and on. Just tell me about that fancy stuff, and then let's get to the conversation.
Well, first of all, it's great to be here. It's great to see you. Great to chat with you again, and I look forward to this conversation. I think it'll be a very interesting hour that we'll spend together. So I've been, for the past couple of years, research fellow at the Berkley Center for Religion, Peace and World Affairs at Georgetown University, where I have been mostly working on this larger project about American religion, American civil religion, and I would argue the heretics of American civil religion. That's to say those individuals, those religious thinkers, religious leaders who rejected, for fundamental reasons, the American political ideals of liberalism, democracy, religious pluralism, what have you. So I've been studying this for a while. I actually came to study American religion after a brief stint at the State Department and under the Obama administration. Secretary of State John Kerry set up an office entitled the Office of Religion and Global Affairs, to provide sort of expertise to the building, people working in the building, the foreign policy establishment, our diplomats out in the field, to have a better idea of the way in which people's religious beliefs and religious communities and religious movements impact the places in which we're engaged and our foreign policy priorities and agenda. So I spent some time there, and prior to that, I was a professor of Judaic Studies for a number of years and interested in the emergence of modern Judaism in the sort of the Enlightenment period in Europe up until the rise of Zionism in the late 19th and early 20th century. So I've for many, many years been thinking about the intersection, the relationship of religion and politics. So it makes me a great cocktail party conversationalist, as you can imagine. So I think that's my basic background. And I came to, I guess, send you an email one morning because I was studying the way in which your father, Frank Schaeffer, was involved in the emergence of what we call the new religious right, and particularly the theological political dimensions of the new religious right, which we, for long have seen as an important political movement, particularly in Republican politics. But I was interested in trying to understand the ideas, and particularly the anxieties about liberal democracy that were involved in the emergence of that movement, and the way in which that movement operated and the political priorities that went into place. So I think that was the leading edge. And of course, your father is kind of an interesting and idiosyncratic figure within the story of American religion, in large part because for most of his career, I guess the most important part of his career, he was not based in the United States of America. He was based in Switzerland. And he was doing most of his writing. He came to be essentially often described as an evangelical guru because of his stature in Libri in Switzerland. So a number of books that I was reading sort of talked about the emergence of his thought, both in a larger cultural critique of not American democracy as such, but sort of the modern West and modern West's crisis of confidence, so to speak, that he was writing about in the 60s and 70s, but also how he helped impact the emergence of the right because of his anti-abortion position. And then later, I guess his last book, Christian Manifesto, which became a very important book in 1981, 1982, when it was first written and received. So I think that's the backstory of how I came to contact you. And I think it provides maybe a place where we can begin the conversation.
Yeah, well, first of all, let me just say to anybody watching, next time you're going to call me to rehash the history of the Schaeffer family's involvement with the formation of the religious right, call Jerome. Because I'm tired of talking about it. I'm tired of talking about it. I thought I had escaped it until Donald Trump came along, and then his followers stormed the Capitol building, and everybody wanted to know, who are these people doing this in the name of Jesus? And all of a sudden, there's a whole another generation of folks who want to know about the religious right. But I want to start our conversation somewhere else. It just happens, because I booked this with you some time ago, that the time frame in which you and I are talking right now is the time frame in which Kabul and the rest of Afghanistan has fallen to the Taliban. Basically what you could call a fundamentalist Islamic cult, very much along the lines of the American religious right in terms of their goal of establishing a theocratic form of government, which they call Sharia law, on a country that was trying to move a little bit towards more democratic forms of government, with room for women, and maybe not every gay person would be taken out and stoned to death or beheaded if they criticize the mullahs. And so weirdly enough, you and me are talking about the theocratic move of the religious right in America at a moment in which the mirror image of what people like Rusesh Rushdoony were calling for in the US with his Reconstructionist movement, which was the execution of gay people, defending slavery, all these things that just seem unthinkable to anybody interested in democracy or liberal Western tradition. I knew guys like this on the Christian right who were literally, not hyperbolically, but literally pushing for the same type of government based on Old Testament biblical law as the Taliban is right now in Afghanistan, as they try to take that country back over again in the name of Islamic law. So it just happens you and me are talking about something that is really pressing right now in history, period, American history particularly, because we've got the fruit of the work that I did with my dad back in the 70s and 80s in establishing the religious right as a political power that we succeeded at all too well in that it took over the Republican Party. Post-Trump, fall of Afghanistan to the Taliban, round two. Really interesting to me that you did this thing with John Kerry on trying to inform our State Department and government about how religious thinking impacts world affairs at the very moment when it seems our government completely underestimated the impact of religion in Afghanistan, which after 20 years, you'd think we'd understand. Footnote, and then I'm going to stop talking because I want to interview you. We've consistently underestimated the Wahhabists coming out of Saudi Arabia and the impact they've had on world affairs with the financing of all sorts of terrorist organizations by billionaire businessmen out of that country. And we're continuing to not connect the dots when it comes to the religious right here in this country. So here's my first question to you. What would it take to get the US government and the American mainstream media to at last examine the religious right in the US as a potential terrorist entity, or at least one pushing for anti-democratic, not just non-democratic, anti-democratic agenda of theocracy, and at the same time also admit on a world stage that fundamentalism run amok, whether it's Hindu nationalism or a certain type of West Bank settlement or a certain type of Christian theocracy idea here, or the Taliban, is huge. So we always had discussions about who the Russians were as communists, but we never talk about the religious roots of just about everything that's happening today. What's it going to take? And what would you tell these guys if you had 10 minutes with Joe Biden, the State Department, our military leaders, to talk them into taking this stuff seriously? Go.
Well, I'd first tell them, I'd put an advert and say you should watch some of the content that we put up at the Berkley Center at Georgetown, because there are a lot of great scholars and writers and journalists who are passing through an organization like the Berkley Center and there are many other people who are doing this kind of work. I was watching a conference, a virtual conference at Indiana University yesterday that looked at white Christian nationalism. So there are people who are doing this work, and that they're scholars, they're journalists who are out there who are doing this work, who've been essentially ringing this bell for a very long time.
Yeah.
So just prick up your ears a little bit and listen.
Yeah.
The second thing is that we had an event back at the very beginning of this year, which was the insurrection at the Capitol building on January 6th, which in some respects was a manifestation of a theological, political assault on democracy, quite literally. And if you go and you watch the videos from that day, you look at things like the Jericho March, you look at the religious imagery and paraphernalia and prayers that were done, it is very clear that there were religious ideas and religious passions that were animated on that day. So this is not, I'm not trying to be histrionic here. We had an event which could be seen as an event of theological, political importance. And I think it's very important as the House of Representatives is doing its study of this event, to keep in mind that there was this religious dimension, that there were certain religious ideologies, and it wasn't just limited to white Christian nationalism or evangelicals. They were people who identified as Catholics, Mormons, Jews, charismatics, neo-pagans who were involved in that event. So I think also it's important that we don't sort of just limit our gaze at one particular religious community or one particular theology. This is something that goes across many, many different communities. And I think one of the things that they all share is an anxiety or a rejection of liberal democracy and liberal modernity.
What is the threat that they reject as they see it?
Well,
Combine them all together, the same thing.
I think, if we kind of back up and we look at, say, the emergence of the new Christian right, we just take that as a phenomenon in the mid-1970s. I think it was an anxiety, and again, there are lots of people involved, and there's actually a lot of seed money coming from Republican operatives, conservative operatives that were funding things like the Moral Majority. Right? The Moral Majority wasn't a bottom-up organization; it was a more top-down organization, as you well know. Yeah. But the reason why I think these movements had legs was because of the rapid social, cultural shifts that had occurred from the 1950s to the mid-70s, right? So civil rights, feminism, gay rights, the student movement in the 60s, the Vietnam War, and the sense of decline in power that was felt in the mid-1970s after the sort of collapse of the Vietnam War, the economic crisis, right? The stagflation, the general sense of malaise and cultural drift was something that I think impacted not only white evangelicals, but many people in the country. Many people went to different directions. But for white evangelicals, for the people who became part and parcel of the new Christian right, the Moral Majority, and what have you, for them it was a anxiety about a loss of what they believed was their country, right? Their country was taken away, and of course there were many enemies, but the banner for the group that was taking away their power, their prestige, their hegemony in the United States was secular humanism. Right? So secular humanism was behind the women's movement, the gay movement, the civil rights movement, right? Everything could be lumped there. Now, what's interesting about the new religious right, and I think, and this is why the Reconstructionists are kind of an interesting phenomena within it, is that for the most part, they didn't want to reject America, right? They claimed to be restorationists, right? They claimed to bring America back, right? They were MAGA before there was MAGA. They were Make America Great Again. Of course, their vision of what great America was their understanding of the 1950s, right? So they were kind of trying to jump back, but using this myth of America as being birthed as a Christian nation, as grounding their ideology, right? So when you look at someone like Falwell, you look at a book like Luce in America, which was the manifesto of the moral majority, it didn't argue against the ideas of democracy as such, or sort of the American constitutional republic. It wanted to baptize those notions in a sense.
Yeah.
But what it wanted to do was to say that there was a kind of conspiracy to weaken what they had originally meant. Now, when you look at someone like Rushdoony, or Gary North, the sort of the leadership of the Reconstructionist movement, it becomes a bit more complicated because they did not see the Constitution as emphatically creating a Christian nation as they understood it. Right? For Rushdoony, kind of equivocated on the issue. Gary North was very clear that the Constitution was a Unitarian conspiracy against the original sort of Puritan planting of the 17th century. And for them, the return was not just a return to a kind of Norman Rockwell white picket fence America, where everyone knew their place and things looked like, the white Christian Protestant order that they had grown up within. But for them, it would be the biblical law was the alternative to the messiness of liberal democracy and the messiness of human-made law, right? Yeah. And so here, I think that there's a real interesting comparison between someone like Rushdoony or Gary North and someone like Said Qutb in Egypt, who was one of the founders of modern Islamicism, right? Where any kind of political organization that is based on human will will fundamentally, in their eyes, be unjust and illegitimate. And the only legitimate and only just political order is one that is based on divine will through the revelation of a divine law. And this is where the elements of the new Christian right in America have a problem, because most Christians reject the notion of the applicability of the Mosaic law, right? So there's a kind of equivocation. And there was a very famous article in 1986 in Christianity Today entitled "Democracy is Heresy," where the magazine was essentially trying to excommunicate the Reconstructionists from the larger movement of evangelical Christianity because of its belief that the biblical law would be the proper legitimate structure of all society. Yeah, so I think it's an interesting tension that kind of runs through conservative Protestantism from the early 70s through today.
Well, back in the 1980s, of course, I knew all the people you're talking about, Gary North and Luce Rushdoony and so forth, were all friends of ours. I knew them well. I stayed with them sometimes when I would travel. But the big point you've made that I think needs to be addressed is that if you fast forward to the present, that hesitancy on the part of right-wing evangelical white Christians to embrace a full-fledged mistrust at best of democracy and antipathy towards it at worst has now happened. Post-Trump, with rejecting the election result and saying that he won and Biden lost, by bringing all these crazy recounts and everything else that have been thrown out by all the local Republican officials everywhere, and judges appointed by everybody from Bush to Trump himself. Nevertheless, the polls go to show that a large majority of evangelical white voters for Trump are now not just mistrustful of our democracy, rejecting the results of a national election, but are the people who are fomenting in state after state after state laws to, as it were, put in place the machinery for Republican operatives in the minority, even when they lose, to roll back election results they don't like. And so it's not a formal embrace of Rushdoony and Gary North's position that somehow we need biblical law transposed from the Old Testament into America to basically replace the Constitution. But subtly, it's its own version of that. And if you had asked me 20 years ago, could this ever happen? I would have said absolutely not. Maybe a couple people on the fringe, but this is never coming to pass. So we've come to a place now so far beyond, for instance, what my father was advocating in a Christian Manifesto, which was to bring America back to what he saw as its Christian democratic roots that had been squandered because of secular humanism and liberal thought and so forth, by any means possible, including perhaps violence in the case of abortion. We're now much further ahead than that, and we are really on the same plane as the Taliban, for instance, who believe that any kind of secular government or constitutional government has to be replaced by Sharia law and Quranic law to be legitimate and to actually work. So I never would have foreseen this, but how do you feel about what I just said? Am I overstating it, or is that where the evangelical community is today? Or do the folks within it realize they have crossed that line and now they are really an anti-democracy movement, not just a pro-Christian movement?
Yeah, I think there are a lot of things to unravel here. So first, I think that the question of the legitimacy of the election seems new, but in fact is not necessarily new. I think there was if you go back to the election of Bill Clinton in 1992, and it was, remember, he didn't win an outright majority because we had the Ross Perot candidacy as well. But there was a sense that Bill Clinton was an illegitimately elected president because of that, but also because of his own background, right? And the issues of Vietnam and the draft and a whole host of issues. And the Clinton presidency was essentially plagued by attempts by the right wing, there's the vast right-wing conspiracy, as Hillary Clinton said, to undermine his legitimacy. And I think you saw something similar in the wake of the election of Barack Obama, where birtherism, right, the idea to claim that, in fact, that Obama is not really an American, and therefore he's an illegitimate president. So this idea of the illegitimacy of a democratic, not only a democratically elected president, but a president from the Democratic Party, right? A president who's not a conservative, is not something new. We've seen this, I think, from the early 90s. Now, what's interesting about Trump is, during the primary campaign, there were a number of candidates who seemed to be a better fit for conservative evangelicals than Donald J. Trump, right? And, for example, Ted Cruz, whose father is a known Dominionist preacher, right? And it was Trump who, because of his charisma, because of his outsider status, because of his dabbling with birtherism earlier on, was able to get enough momentum to take to win the primary. And at the beginning, there was a lot of discussion that this was really a transactional relationship, right? That Trump was going to be the guy who was going to deliver the goods, right? He was essentially going to. He wasn't seen as a sort of an evangelical himself, as George W. Bush was, but he was seen as someone who's going to give them what they needed, in a way closer to Reagan. If you go back to the 1980s election, where the conservative Protestants opted for the divorced Ronald Reagan rather than the born-again Jimmy Carter, that he was going to be someone who's going to give them what they wanted. And he wrote out the list of who his candidates for the Supreme Court would be, right? He started bringing these people in his inner circle and began to speak their language. And in many respects, he delivered, right? He delivered, particularly in the Supreme Court. But then something else happened, which is that he was seen as not only someone who's going to sort of provide, sort of the kickback, so to speak, but he was seen as a strong man. And at the core of Trumpism, I think, is Schadenfreude, right? Owning the libs, right? Here's someone he's going to go out there, whether or not you win or not at the end of the day, right? Whether or not you get, the tax cuts are going to you or the services are going to you, you enjoy the cultural fight, right? That there was a difference in tone between Ronald Reagan and George W. Bush and Donald Trump, that he was now a fighter, right? Not only a transactional guy who's going to give you what you want, but he's going to someone who's going to go and fight the culture war for you. And somehow that transformed into almost a kind of a sacred kingship, right? And some of the language that you heard coming from evangelicals to justify their support for Trump. He's like a Cyrus, right? It's like a King Cyrus who returned the Judeans to the land of Israel and rebuilt the temple. Or he's like a King David. King David was known to be a complicated character, but he was God's anointed and beloved of God. Of course, they never tell you the end of the King David story, right? Yeah. We never get to the tragic end. So there's a way in which the theology became linked to the person of Trump. And so that the defeat of Trump could not be seen as a defeat. There had to be some kind of conspirational background to it, which of course Trump ginned up himself, cultivated. And so, and then of course there are ways in which other factors like the QAnon phenomenon sort of flowed into this. So there are a lot of different strings, a lot of different elements. It's going to take a very long time for researchers and journalists and scholars to go and sort of figure out what was really going on. But again, I think that Donald Trump was not being called upon to implement the Mosaic Law. He was called upon to appoint conservative judges. He was called upon to create a broader space of religious freedom for conservative Protestants or other conservative religious groups, particularly on issues about gay rights or access to healthcare and what have you. Now, to swing back to earlier, you mentioned your father and the Christian Manifesto. I think you're right. What's interesting about the Christian Manifesto is in a way the way the book pulls its punches in the end. Right? There's an angry tone. There's a sense that there's this cultural conflict between secular humanism and Judeo-Christian. He sometimes uses the term Judeo-Christian values are clashing. There's this open window at the beginning of the Reagan administration, but who knows how long that open window will stay open, will last. There is an attempt to sort of draw a line from Scottish Presbyterianism through John Witherspoon and the Declaration of Independence and the Constitution to the present day. But in the end, he's not advocating for theocracy. And he says very clearly, I'm not talking about theocracy. I get very nervous when we sort of drape the flag on the cross, right? At the end of the day, he kind of wants a First Amendment settlement, right? And it's on this point that Rushdoony and North really take him to task and say he doesn't have the courage of his convictions, right? Yes. At the end, he should turn to theocracy. He should turn to say, we should want a Calvin's Geneva, or we should want a Puritan New England. But at the end of the day, he's, Francis Schaeffer is really in the end a humanist, right? In the end, he capitulates.
Well, you can see where their logic goes, because the next generation of Reconstructionists, theonomists, and so forth, all the way up, including the people who are fans of Mike Pence, maybe Mike Pence himself, became fans of Putin because he was a strong man who pushed back against gays, had a close tie to the Russian Orthodox Church, did religious things. And in a weird way, they had a similarly benign look at the Saudi Arabians, in the sense that at least these guys know what to do with gay people and women who get pushy. That's not what they would say, and I'm being a little bit facetious, but almost. So that the next generations and the next iterations of the religious right after my father, first of all, would have criticized him for not going far enough, as you said, and Rushdoony and Gary North already did in his lifetime. They were not fans of his because of that at the end, but he didn't go far enough for them. But also, it is odd that the religious right in the US in the Trump era has been more sympathetic to Vladimir Putin than they have been to the US government in terms of its more traditional democratic posture on things like women's rights, gay rights, these other things. And so in a way, you know people by their friends. And it's very interesting to me that not only are there similarities with the rise of the Taliban again in Afghanistan, but that beyond that, so many white evangelical Christians are even sympathetic with the kind of nationalistic white posture of somebody like Vladimir Putin. But beyond that, because of Trump, now have sort of adopted this idea of needing a strong man, looking for that voice. And I think in the future, candidates running for office on the national scene who present themselves as Republicans are going to have to pick up that mantle of the kind of non-democratic strongman Trump posture that folks are looking for. And your whole idea about owning the libs is all part of this. And then your thing about seeing Trump as a kind of a theological being chosen by God in a way that excuses him from any kind of misbehavior, in the way that David is still used by God in spite of being an adulterer and a murderer and so forth in the Bible, is all part of this too. But at the end of the day, I think that our culture, the kind of people who hopefully you're influencing through the Berkley Center, have still not caught up with the fact that these folks are very serious and they are numerous, and that when you look at the template of South Africa, where I lived for a year making a couple movies out there in the mid 1980s, it doesn't take a majority to manipulate a country, because you can have a kind of a form of apartheid where the actual opinion and will of the majority is canceled again and again by the way your system is set up. And in that case, it was purely race. But here in the US, it's a kind of a conservatism that wants to cancel majority rule if it goes against them on anything from gun rights to abortion to companies being able to deny civil rights to gay couples, for instance, if it's a company owned by evangelicals, as if somehow the law doesn't apply to them. So I think we're at another stage now. How that all will unfold in the future, I don't know. And before I ask you for your opinion on that, let me just remind folks that you're watching In Conversation with Frank Schaeffer. This is a podcast you can also listen to or replay if you're not seeing it live on Facebook. I'm with Jerome Copulsky, Research Fellow at the Berkley Center for Religion, Peace, and World Affairs at Georgetown University. And there will be links to that along with this podcast. If you want to find him and communicate with him, we will show you how. That said, how do you see this unfolding, Jerome, as we go forward? What is the next step? Where do we go next in terms of this battle between people who believe in democracy and our Constitution, and this strong theocracy movement that also is attached to the strongman model of leadership, and also is openly now anti-democracy, in that they would prefer not to have democracy if it doesn't go their way. And they've shown themselves very clearly to be of that mind. How do you see this playing out now?
Yeah, well, there are a lot of different elements I want to hit on. So first, you mentioned the interest, the kind of Putin curiousness of people on the right, and particularly because he's a strong man, but because he's seen as, and he has styled himself, Vladimir Putin has self-styled himself as a defender of traditional Western values, right?
Yeah.
There's the kind of Putin light, which is Viktor Orban in Hungary. And in the past, it was like 2 weeks ago, Tucker Carlson made his pilgrimage to Hungary. But there have been other intellectuals.
And Fox News has been paying homage to him.
Right. Fox News, Rod Dreher, known for the Benedict option. So there's an interest in Viktor Orban as someone who's defending these Western values, defending them against against whom, right? The invaders, right? They're also interested in the Law and Justice Party in Poland. So when you started talking about Putin, and I started thinking about these other sort of former Soviet satellite states in Eastern Europe, I was thinking of a famous article which became a book that was published in the late 1980s by Francis Fukuyama, titled "The End of History."
Yeah, I remember it well. I read it at the time. Yep.
And it was famously wrong, but it was still famously interesting. Fukuyama argued essentially that with the rolling back of the Soviet Union, essentially the collapse of Soviet communism, the great political ideological struggles of the 20th century had ended, right? Fascism was defeated in 1945. Marxism was in the process of going into the dustbin of history. And the only man standing, so to speak, was liberal democracy, right? And everything else would be a mopping up operation. And this was the end of history, right? That over time, liberal democracy and the Western sort of market system was going to be really the only game in town. And he said, there'll still be pockets of resistance from religion, particularly sort of with Islamic fundamentalism and nationalism, but really these are just going to be like little flares, little fires, right? And he says at the end of history, he says at the end of the article, the end of history, the end of these great ideological conflicts, which, for Fukuyama really was finally a working out of the Enlightenment ideas and the American and French revolutions. It'll be the end of history. There will no longer be these grand ideological conflicts, and it will be kind of a sad time. It'll be kind of a boring time, right? Because it is essentially is just going to be the triumph of bourgeois humanity. Now, Fukuyama was wrong in his prediction that this was going to be the end of history. But he was right in the sense that I think what we're seeing in these different movements are frustration with the triumph of liberalism, right? The triumph of globalism, that somehow this is not working, and religion provides a sort of a mechanism of resistance, a way of understanding the world in a way that provides meaning, provides structure, provides hope, right? A lot of these, Christianity, Judaism have a messianic hope. There's a direction to history that even if we're not winning now, we will be victorious in the end. So I think that's part of the story. And if you look at, people who are interested in these movements, there's a whole slew of thinkers and philosophers and ideologues coming out of the European right that American, we'd call them alt, maybe, sort of people who are associated with the alt-right, are interested in. People like Alexander Dugin, for example, who is a philosopher coming out of Russia, and the sense that liberal democracy itself is collapsing because of its own internal contradictions. There was an interesting book by an American political theorist named Patrick Deneen entitled "Why Liberalism Failed," and it came out, I think, in 2017, so probably right on the heels of the Trump election. Interesting enough, Barack Obama recommended this to one summer for a summer reading group. And Deneen's book is essentially argues that liberalism has won, and liberalism will fail because it has won, because it is based on a flawed understanding of human nature, a flawed understanding of human community. And so the resistance that we're seeing from traditionalist religious groups is a good and healthy thing. Right. So that was my first point. The second point, to go back to the Reconstructionists like Washingtonian North, what's interesting about their work is that they really don't have a strong man concept, right? That they make it very clear, and they utilize their post-millennial eschatology to ground this. That they're not trying for a political coup, right? They're not trying for the strong man to come over, take over a country, implement the law. They believe that, I think North says this may be 1,000-year process, right, by which the Holy Spirit animates people to become regenerated Christians who will then put democratically essentially put into place this kind of biblical theocracy as they manage it. So they're interesting because they don't really fit into these models. But what they do is they created this language of dominion, right? This dominion theology that take back that God had created the world, and if you look at Genesis 1:26-28, had created the human being to be a vicegerent.
Well, and Rushdoony applied that, by the way, to the apartheid state in South Africa, based on the same kind of reform thinking he was reflecting, that they were in essence a dominionist project of ruling lesser people, because he was also a slavery proponent, or at least justified slavery, and that this somehow was benevolent for the people who they needed to bring along with them by ruling them. And that was why he was a supporter of apartheid.
Yeah, there's the slavery issue in these guys is really interesting, because on the one hand, they argue slavery as, rather than prisons for punishment, slavery as restitution for crime. Yeah. Right. So this is what you get in the Institutes of Biblical Law, where Rushdoony spends a lot of time saying, we need, wants to undo the prison industrial complex of humanism, get rid of that, and essentially restitution for crime. And if you can't afford restitution, then you enter into a bond relationship. So he kind of mentions that. He says this is, all along, sort of the lines of biblical law, and in ways that is more humane and more just than a prison system. But then if you go and you look at other texts, like his Politics of Guilt and Pity, or Pity and Guilt, and you look at some of the earlier essays in this Independent Republic, or Nature of the American System, particularly Nature of the American System, he cites for several pages a sermon given by Benjamin Palmer following the election of Abraham Lincoln. And Benjamin Palmer was in New Orleans. He was a Southern Presbyterian preacher and theologian, arguing for secession and arguing for the Orthodox South's theological political struggle against the apostate North.
Was he any part of the the 1885 secession of the Southern Baptists from the General Baptist movement in support of slavery, or was that?
Well, that's early. So the Baptists.
I may have the date wrong, by the way.
Yeah. So the Baptists and the Methodists secede in 1840s over the issue.
Okay, 1840s.
The Southern Presbyterians actually don't. There was an earlier split in American Presbyterianism between old school and new school, but the Southern Presbyterian Church splits with the secession itself. So I think in 1861 you have this. So he would, but his work and the work of his teacher, John Henley Thornwell, are classics of pro-slavery literature. And in this pro-slavery literature, you go back to the 1830s, it emerges as a way of dealing with the rise of abolitionism. So the abolitionist movement is using scripture, using Christianity to argue argue against the crime of chattel slavery in the South. Yeah. These pro-slavery ministers and theologians are going to the Bible and using chapter and verse to prove that it is authorized by the Hebrew Bible as well as the New Testament. So you have this theological struggle that's going on, each side using the Bible for different purposes, which is why Lincoln famously used the phrase, both sides have the same Bible, pray to the same God, and yet the war came. So I mentioned Palmer because Rushdoony's his work in the 1960s, he's appealing to Palmer as a voice of orthodox complaint against the apostate Unitarian North that is pushing for this war. And in other places in his writings, he definitely downplays the horrors and the crime of the enslavement of Africans in this country. So there's, there are oftentimes that they would try to say, oh, the media is getting them wrong on slavery because really they're talking restitution, but those
threads are there.
But the threads are still there.
Yeah, I want to slightly change the subject because, I think when you look back at my dad's work and Rushdoony and North and these other guys, I know that you understand that my father was someone who did not fit in with them, and they fell out with him because he didn't, quote, go far enough. It always seems to me that for people who are familiar with his work, that if he had stopped writing and not made his film series with me, that I talked him into making, which is a different story of how that all happened, which we can go into sometime. And it's a kind of a tragedy, because I think actually I helped destroy his reputation in a horrible kind of way as a young, ambitious person who was his sidekick. And you know, be careful what you wish for, that your nepotistic children will follow you into the ministry, because they may just be more ambitious than you are. You know, this is Shakespearean in scope. And I played a really bad role in that, which I have been trying to undo for many, many years now as a progressive activist who writes about these subjects and so forth. But it seems to me that if my dad had ended his writing, even with his book, How Should We Then Live, which was, I guess, an argument for not a theocracy, but an argument for restoring America to its Christian roots and its Western roots against secular humanism, he would not be known as one of the founders of the religious right. But unfortunately, because of the film series and book, Whatever Happened to the Human Race, that he co-authored with C. Everett Koop, and that I produced into a film series, and then Koop becomes Surgeon General for Ronald Reagan, he ends on a note of a co-belligerency, as he would see it, a cooperation with people like Falwell, the Moral Majority, Pat Robertson, Focus on the Family, all these other actors, some of them very bad actors, because of abortion. You know, we can see that they're flakes and almost running criminal enterprises on one hand, but because this issue is so paramount, we're going to pretend none of that exists. Even in the case of Rousas Rushdoony, you know, not drawing more clear distinctions with these people, because we're all on the same side on this big pressing issue of abortion. So I think that in a strange way, Roe v. Wade really undid my father's reputation as a more thoughtful, culturally oriented person interested in the arts and culture, who certainly ran a ministry that was very above board and non-criminal when it came to how the money was spent and so forth. In addition to which, really reaching out to people and embracing them in a more traditional form of Christian love, which was also a hallmark of a lot of evangelicalism. Before that, in your researches of my father, how do you find what I'm talking about as you look at him from the outside? I have my opinion, but I have a bias. How do you see that? Yeah, so, you know, there are actually kind of two angles that I want to go on this. The first is that your father was a student or learned from Cornelius Van Til. Yes. Right. And Van Til is kind of the point of connection between your father and Rushdoony, and that Van Til, his work was this idea of presuppositionalism, right? And essentially, in a crude way, it provides a kind of either or, right? Yeah. You kind of make a decision to believe that the Bible is kind of the font of all knowledge, right? And then once you're in that magic circle, you're in that magic circle. Yeah. So, and therefore, you know, once you have that kind of biblical worldview, then you have I guess, an Archimedean point from which to understand and judge everything else. Now, Rushdoony essentially took that and then said, oh, well, I need something we have kind of negating the possibility of natural law, we're negating the possibility of any kind of human knowledge outside of the Bible. I need to build on it to go forward. And what am I going to use? Well, I'm going to use the revelation of the law, right? The law becomes the thing that becomes the positive thing. And your father actually had different ways of saying what that positive thing was. Yes. Right? Yeah. That wasn't this, right? Christian way of being in the world, which didn't need to be structured by the warp and woof of the do's and don'ts of, the commandments. Yeah. Now, the other thing I think to look at the other side is what happens to C. Everett Koop once he becomes Surgeon General and once he's faced with the power and responsibility and the AIDS crisis. Yeah. And when he's faced with that, C. Everett Koop becomes, in the eyes of people like Rushdoony and North, a humanist. Yes. Right. He betrays the movement by saying this is a public health catastrophe that needs to be dealt with, and how do we deal with it? Well, we deal with it with science. We suggest
forms of safe sex practice, use of condoms, what have you, right? And if you look at, there's a book by Gary North that came out, I think, in 1987 called Political Polytheism. It's about 700, 800 pages. It's huge. And he goes after Rushduni for not going far enough. He goes after your father. He goes after the evangelical historians like Mark Knoll, who were arguing against this, right? And he, in the section on your father, he says, we see how, in fact, they did not have the courage of their convictions by what happens to C. Everett Koop, right? When he's actually, right? And that actually, I think, sort of exposes, if you want to do, if we can do guilt by association, we could also do maybe responsibility by association, right? It showed that Koop as a doctor, as a scientist, as a policymaker, was able to sort of separate out, his own, certain dimensions of his own belief, or sort of.
And he, by the way, I'm going to let you continue, but just a footnote to what you're saying, he did the same thing when it came to certain pro-life groups that were citing studies of breast cancer incidence in women who had had abortion and or depression and suicide. And he said, this is bogus. I'm against abortion, but let's not have fake science backing up our points. There are no such studies, and nothing has been shown to be true in this area. And they went crazy at him. They also, Rushduni was denouncing him, but so did pro-life people, because they said, you betrayed us, because he wouldn't sign on to the non-scientific propagandistic stuff. He kept his argument on a philosophical, religious, and moral basis, but he would not buy into the non-scientific or even anti-science footnotes, apocryphal conspiracy theory stuff, even on abortion, let alone on gay rights as it related to AIDS. Just a footnote. Keep going. Yeah.
Well, so I think that it showed, I think there's a, part of the Francis Schaeffer stories is a kind of story about the temptations of power.
Yes. Yeah.
And the tragedy of what happens when you get pulled into a system. Because, again, when we started this conversation, I said that the new religious right was seeded by money that saw that it could use the religious and moral issues to get particular political policy outcomes, right? So
and I'll just interject something. A lot of the fundraising I was doing for our anti-abortion projects from people like the DeVos family, and Rich DeVos in particular, who then went on and had a son or son-in-law who started Blackwater and all this other stuff. The Koch brothers never financed us directly, but they financed people who were financing us. I had meetings with the Hunt brothers in Texas, who were having to do testify on trying to corner the silver market. I mean, really crazy things, very rich people, and so forth and so on. So we were able to make a jump from this small pietistic Christian mission in Switzerland by getting into the culture war. Suddenly, where my father would have considered a big deal for someone to send a check to Labrie for $1,000, I had people like Rich DeVos writing me checks for $100,000 at a time in order to make whatever happened to the human race and so forth, with no interest at all in the issue of abortion personally, but just seeing this as yet another stepping stone for mobilizing a culture war to empower his values, which were incredibly capitalistic and so forth and so on. And then when it came to the evangelical leaders, people like Pat Robertson, all of whom I knew personally very well, they were jumping on board because ginning up the level of anger was their way of raising money. If you're telling people to send you $25 to save America, you have to point out, how America is going to hell in a handcart today, and I'll stop this, whether it's gay rights or abortion. So it suited everybody to get on board. And I personally, as a young man, of course, speaking about the lure of power and access to power, was very much seduced by all this access, including, as I mentioned to you once in a conversation, Jerry Falwell lending me his jet and a pilot to go around so I wouldn't have to take commercial flights while I was doing all these speaking gigs filling in for my dad and so forth. So I just want to interject that I saw exactly where the money was coming from and how to play it. And I was only in my 20s and I totally got it. And if you went to these super rich people like DeVos, and he interpreted what you were doing as striking a blow for capitalism, you were home free. And the issue at hand, whether it was being against gays or women or abortion, that was a footnote. The point was always how to own the libs and to stir up your own side to send the money and vote the way you wanted them to vote on issues that had nothing to do with what you were pitching them.
Yeah, there's a good line. I can't remember who actually said it in a describing Jerry Falwell's Listen America as, there are more references, there are more quotations from Milton Friedman than Amos or Micah.
Yeah, absolutely.
Right? This text is not about, it's often conceived as a Jeremiad, right, against, to call America back to its moral foundations.
Yeah.
But somehow those moral foundations, if you actually kind of look at a lot of the policies, those moral foundations aligned very well with the priorities of American political conservatives.
Yeah, and I mean, the Koch brothers played this like a violin with what their funding went to their think tanks and all these other places to just keep this thing rolling forever. So, it was hard to get evangelical white middle class, lower middle class, and working class voters into the polling booth on economic issues or whatever it would be. But if you could get them mad enough, as in we're losing our country to fill in the blank, Black people, gay people, feminists, abortionists, then you were talking, and it worked. And of course, my father and I were culpable in that. But in some ways, we also were really just stupid, because in case people didn't know it, back in those days, making our anti-abortion films, we were completely sincere in that. We might have been wrong. We were wrong. And I came to change my position later in ways I've described in great detail in my writing. But we were sincere. But I have to tell you that when it came to people like Pat Robertson, Jerry Falwell, Focus on the Family, these other guys, they just saw this as a fundraising opportunity. And there never was a sincere, honest moment that they then slid from as they were seduced. They went in with a plan to use every single one of these issues for monetary gain for their outfits. They all became personally exorbitantly wealthy on this stuff. And the whole thing was really just more like a criminal enterprise where, you're not drug dealing, you are culture war dealing.
I mean, it's very interesting to see where sort of the son of Jerry Falwell ended up, right? And wrote, the very tight linkage between Jerry Falwell Jr. And Trump.
Well, even more than that, I knew Billy Graham personally and was in meetings where he was declaring the fact that he was pro-choice on the basis of Christian compassion. He would not join our pro-life crusade. And then to see his son not only become the number one co-conspirator with Falwell with Falwell Jr. to bring the evangelical vote into Trump, but also then go one step further than almost anybody else in the country after the January 6th uprising and storming of the Capitol. And the only people he criticized in print were the 11 Republicans who voted to censure the president afterwards. And he put a target on their back as having been traitors to Donald Trump. I mean, it's unthinkable that Billy Graham would have done this.
And Billy Graham had his, he went through, he had his own sort of crisis when, with
Nixon.
His relationship with Nixon. So when, with the fall of Nixon, Billy Graham has a kind of moment of repentance for.
Well, and he mentioned that to my dad and me when we met with him. He says, I went there with Nixon. I'm not doing it again, as one of many reasons why he would not jump on board the anti-abortion bandwagon. He was done with that kind of political hard-edged, knives out, culture war in your face stuff.
Yeah, and he also moves on from a kind of an American exceptionalism in that his later stage of his career. So he, turns outwards and becomes a very different kind of figure than what we see today in the American religious right. The other point I'd want to make, which I think is interesting as far as Trumpism and religion is concerned, is that the part of, there's something very funny about someone whose very brand is gold, sort of gold plated, ostentatious displays of wealth, to become the poster boy for for American Christianity. There's the role of the prosperity gospel preachers in this as a particular form of Christianity. But there's also the role in which there's the critique of corporate power, right? Particularly the anti-globalist dimension of the isolationist dimension of this new movement is interesting. Now, I'm not so sure how much of that is tied on to Trump himself, how much of that is tied into sort of larger currents of thought or sensibility, but it is something that's interesting to watch out for.
Listen, we have a lot more to talk about, and we're at the top of the hour here, so we're going to come back and do this again soon. If you will do it, Jerome, would you come back and do another one? In the meantime, I just want to mention to folks watching this that we have been talking with Jerome Copulsky, who's a research fellow at the Berkley Center for Religion, Peace, and World Affairs at Georgetown University. My name is Frank Schaeffer, and you are watching or listening to a podcast in conversation with Frank Schaeffer. Please get in touch with us or with Jerome. I just want to mention that if you like this podcast or others that we've done, to please spread the word. Also, I have a new book coming out. If you haven't noticed the poster behind me, Fall in Love, Have Children, Stay Put, Save the Planet, Be Happy, which has a lot to do with this conversation. Jerome, maybe next time we'll talk about a little bit. In that, I spent those 10 years with my dad as his sidekick, selling culture war fake family values with no agenda to actually help families at all. Or individuals with relationships or anything else. And I happen to have spent the last 5 years trying to undo a little bit of that damage by writing this book, and I hope it does that. But maybe we'll talk a little more about that another time. Jerome, thank you so much for your time. I really, really enjoyed this conversation. And like I said, next time somebody calls me and says, come tell us about your father's place in American history, I'll say, talk to Jerome. He'll explain everything. Call me if he doesn't know something other than that.
Great bibliography.
Yeah, you got a whole handle on this, way beyond anybody else that I know personally anyway. So listen, stay well. We'll talk again soon. Thank you so much. Thank you, everybody, for watching.
Ciao.